West in the location of the West in a certain sense, or why this time and not another time? I just wondering what you think
I
about
would
this.
have done first is, the first thing here I would apply my own theory the way I began to this. First, I always try to ask, are these designations to be taken for what they are? I think that what people call fundamentalism often covers two very much opposed phenomena. I think that what we usually refer to as fundamentalism, you know, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, that kind of people, I would even deny to them the term fundamentalism. You know how I have a very naive criterion of defending what I'm really tempted to even claim is authentic fundamentalism from this kind of fake fundamentalism. How do you relate? Is there envy or not? Let me be very naive. I don't have any illusions about Tibetan Buddhism. But Tibetan Buddhists that I've met, or Amish, again, I don't have illusions about Amish. According to some statistics, they have the highest rate of family incest, but they are authentic fundamental. You know what did strike me when I met them? They don't have this typical religious fake fundamentalism obsession with what the others gays are doing or what. They are very benevolent. They don't have this hatred towards the others. They don't have the attitude of envy. They live in peace with others. I think the fake fundamentalism is this which is secretly fascinated by the sinful ways of the others and so on and so on. So my next criticism would have been that if you look at it closely, so-called fundamentalism, Pat Robertson, Falwell and their gang, Jimmy Swaggart, not to mention the really big ones and so on, but isn't it that the way they deliver their message undermines the message? In the sense that the way they deliver their message is precisely an instance of what they criticize, a big ego trip and so on and so on. Now, a more difficult question. I totally also agree with you that it's a misnomer, that this is not the only fundamentalism we have. I think even that you know, what surprised me were the violent reactions to, I don't think she's a great theoretician, but it's an interesting book, Naomi Klein's new book, Shock Therapy. What's the important, maybe, I'm not saying she's a great theoretician, but it surprised me how violent the reactions were to the book. Why? Because she touched an important point, how, let's call it liberal economic fundamentalism, how it is not ready to admit how, okay, we have markets, they work, but in order they work, but in order for the markets to work, you need quite a lot of extra market violence. You know, it's not just, this is maybe the biggest utopia of our time, I claim. It's the market utopia, which is why for me, it's not, the official story goes like that. The 90s, 89, 90 is the end of utopias. Finally, we learn to renounce big utopias, plans to reconstruct society, blah, blah. We learn to accept the lesser evil, and so on. But I think the true utopia were the 90s. The utopia, the Fukuyama utopia. And you know, it's easy to make fun of Fukuyama, that idiot who thought the end of history. But basically, even most of my so-called leftist friends, we are all Fukuyamaists, de facto. Most of the leftists that I know, they silently accept the basic Fukuyama premise, which is capitalism with a human face and liberal democracy are the frame which we cannot overcome. All we can do is make it a little bit more tolerant, better, and so on, and so on, and so on. So this is for me the true fundamentalism. It doesn't take into account the extent to which market, in order to function, and already there is a lot of violence, millions losing jobs and so on and so on. There is a much more invisible objective violence of the market. But even if we discount this, market mechanism needs quite a lot of subjective violence. I mean, these are the big debates For example, the well-known English of German origins philosopher Ralph Dahrendorf called this the problem of the valley of tears. Like, democracy functions after you have a certain level of development of economy. But to get to that point, you need 20 years at least of authoritarianism, dictatorship. He openly says this. He says, look at the third world countries, okay, third world, outside the Western Europe, which are economically successful, South Korea, Chile, and so on. His conclusion is they had to go through Pinochet or military dictatorship. But the problem is deeper today for me. If there is a lesson to be learned from China today, it's that, because typically those who have sympathies for this dictatorship, why don't they also support China then today? China is doing exactly this in a much larger amount. The irony is that I know, but the problem is the following one for me, because they have still this old liberal hope that China will get caught in the same dynamic when they still have this trust that after some 10, 20, that sooner or later capitalism does bring with itself democracy, the way we understand it. I think the lesson of China and so-called Asian values capitalism is not. I think that's the true danger today. I think that capitalism is entering a new stage where no longer democracy, the way, even in this formal, limited way we used it, democracy is needed. Democracy is needed. So in this sense, so that I don't get lost, in this sense I totally agree with you about how the term fundamentalism first should be used. We should be very clear how we use it, what we designate with it. We shouldn't limit it to this so-called hardline religious freaks or whatever. No, I mean, the basic fundamentalism today, I think it's precisely this liberal trust in the market mechanism, in the sense of you just have to clear the space for market mechanisms to let it work, market mechanism, and the work will be done. The other problem that I see for me is that the second distinction I would make is that the fundamentalists that I wrote about this in my last big book, Parallax View. I spoke with some fundamentalists in this narrow sense, really. What surprised me is that they are truly a threat to belief. No, not in this sense, authentic belief, but in a much more formal sense. I think the way I understood them, their mystery is that their procedure is that they treat religious statements like Christ has arisen from the dead and so on as simple positive knowledge statements. Which is why, for example, let's take the Turin Shroud. I like these mysteries, you know, is it or not? Every genuine Catholic is horrified by the idea that it may be authentic. Because if it is, you immediately have very delicate problems. Like, okay, then we do the DNA test. And then the question, who is the father of Christ, becomes a very empirical question. And to be cynical, you would probably discover that some probably Arab slave of the Joseph family, no, had something to do. I mean, you never know into what you get, no? But I spoke with some fundamentalists who are usually very pro-science. They say, no, they even have theory. They say, God doesn't have DNA, so it will be Mary's DNA redoubled, just 2 times the same, and so on. You know what I mean? The horrible thing is that for them, again, which is why, true, in this narrow sense, religious fundamentalists, they don't have any problem with science. They basically reduce religious statement to similar positive statements of science, and I think that in this way, even the true greatness of religious belief is lost. As every authentic religious person knows, belief is an existential wager. Belief is not belief in facts. Belief is always a decision, like belief is that I say all people have the same dignity. And it's, in a way, a crazy thing. Because when I look at you, to put it in simple, rational terms, I can say, but I need more than you more, why should... I mean, this is a crazy decision which I accept. There must be something crazy, absurd in an authentic belief. So the paradoxical conclusion for me would have been that this kind of anti-Darwinian fundamentalists and so on, they are not a threat to science. They are a threat to authentic religious belief. The third problem I have here is that what do we mean by belief today, more generally? I think that, again, what I wanted, but I lost the thread, to develop a little, one of the lines that I had to drop out. Like, listen, for me, even New York Times was kind